Good morning, everyone. We're so excited to be here together. Seeing that most of our CPAG members are now present, Sarah, will you please call the roll so we can establish a quorum?
Melanie Green.
Here.
Ed Monanzala.
Here.
Jorge Aguilar. Ron Anaya.
Here.
Bootsy Battle Holt.
Here.
Mia Cooper.
Here.
Diane Grotjohn.
Here.
Joanne Iskin.
Here.
Linda Kaminsky.
Here.
Kimberly Kenny.
Here.
Tara Kinney. Jesse Levin.
Here.
Tarina Small.
Here.
Janelle Woodward.
Here.
Chair Green, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Sarah. I hereby call the August 2021 meeting of the California Practitioners Advisory Group to order at 9:02 a.m. August 20th. I'd like to commence by saluting the flag. There'll be a flag visible at the CDE boardroom. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance
To the
Flag
of
of
the
the United States of America.
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God,
Indivisible.
liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to make a general announcement before we dive into our items today. I want to let everyone know that the State Board of Education is currently recruiting for its advisory commissions, including CPAG. CPAG will have vacancies for the following positions at the conclusion of this year and is seeking applicants to fill these roles. I'll read these roles now. Superintendents or other administrators, principals and other school leaders, parents of students currently enrolled in the K-12 public education system, members of local school boards, career and technical educators. Applications are due at 5 p.m. on September 25th. If you or anyone you know would like to apply, you can find additional information on the State Board of Education's website or by reaching out to Sarah Pachowski. A few logistics before we get started. We will not be taking any formal breaks today as we only have one item, very exciting. Please step away from the meeting as you need to take care of your personal needs, anything that comes up that you need to do. We will take item 2 out of order so that we can approve the minutes from June 2021. And before we move any further, I would like to now invite our incredible board member, Eileen Strauss, to make any framing comments for today's meeting. Eileen?
Hi, so sorry I have some background noise, so I apologize from outside. Thank you everybody for making this work. I know people are just opening school now. It's really, really busy. And I just want to tell you, we've had an amazing opening of school. And I think everyone has been working hard. So thank you for making that time right now. Today's meeting agenda is a result of some legislation change that is asking us to look at the LCAP and to make some modifications. At the July meeting, when we did approve the modifications, I did ask at that time how many forms and different documents the local districts have to complete. I apologize for the trash truck outside. But anyway, currently districts have to complete 5, and now we have some modifications. So I want us to be really thoughtful about how we address legislation, which we need to do, but also make it useful and not just a very lengthy document that isn't meaningful because it's got so much. So just that comment. Secondly, besides recruiting for CPAG, we are recruiting for IQC and our Charter School Advisory Commission. So please reach out. Your service and others make a difference in the work of the state board, so I really appreciate it. We're also looking for a student board member and a student IQC member. We have great students in California. They've had a great voice on all of our roles. So please, if you know some great students, we really appreciate it. And again, thank you for your thoughtfulness today and considerations around what we need to do to meet legislative requirements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Board Member Strauss. We appreciate your framing and being here. A note about public input before we continue. Just a reminder that members of the public wishing to call in for public comment should view the live stream of the meeting to know at what time public comment will occur for each item. Public comment can be provided during the meeting by dialing the phone number and access code that will be listed on the screen during each item. The operator will notify callers when it's their turn to provide public comment. Public comment will be limited to 1 minute. Please remember to turn down the speaker volume of your computers if you are following the live webcast to avoid an echoing effect. And as a reminder, item 3 is our general public comment item, during which members of the public may provide comment on matters that are not specifically listed in the CPAG agenda. Few reminders for our incredible CPAG members: make sure to mute your microphones when not speaking and keep your cameras on to ensure that we maintain a quorum throughout today's virtual meeting. Please use the raise hand feature using the Zoom participant window if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. We are pros at that by now. And as a reminder, the chat function should not be used by CPAG members unless you are in need of technical assistance with Zoom. It's a violation of Bagley Keene to use the chat function to discuss the meeting. And with that, we will go into agenda item number 2. We'll take up item 2 so that we can approve the minutes from the June 2021 CPAG meeting. CPAG members, you were provided the link to those draft minutes that are posted on the CPAG website. I will give everyone about 2 minutes to review, and then we'll open the line up for public comment. CPAG members, as you're reviewing those draft minutes, if you haven't already, I'll just direct members of the public who are viewing the live stream to see the call-in number on the screen, the meeting ID and passcode information that you'll use to call in if you'd like to provide public comment on the draft minutes from the June 2021 CPAG meeting.
I'm going to give it 30 more seconds to see if we have anyone call in.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah.
We have no public comment for this item.
Okay, thank you. I will move now to CPAG discussion. Is there any discussion on this item? I will pull up my participant window so I can check the Zoom hands. All right, seeing no discussion. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from the June 2021 CPAG meeting? Thank you, Linda. I have a motion. Do I have a second? Bootsy, can I take you as a second? Perfect. Motion by Linda, second by Bootsy. Thank you so much. We'll now have a roll call vote. Sarah, when you're ready, please call the roll.
Melanie Green.
Yes, we're approved.
Ed Monasala.
Aye.
Jorge Aguilar. Ron Anaya.
Aye.
Lucy Battle Holt.
Aye.
Nick Cooper.
Aye.
Diane Grochon.
Aye.
Joanne Iskin.
Aye.
Linda Kaminsky.
Aye.
Billy Kenny.
Aye.
Laura Kinney.
I abstain. I wasn't there.
Jesse Levin.
Aye.
Trina Small.
Aye.
Janelle Woodward.
I'll need to abstain. I wasn't there.
All right, motion carries.
All right, thank you so much. I am now so excited to jump into our focus of the meeting. Item number 1, it's an informational item related to revisions to the local control and accountability plan required by Assembly Bill 130 and paragraphs 5 and 6 of subdivision E of California Ed Code section 52064. I know many of us have spent a lot of time with Assembly Bill 130, So excited to spend some more time with it today. This item will be presented by the incredible Josh Strong of the Local Agency System and Support Office. Josh, when you're ready, please begin.
Great. Thank you, Chair Green, members of the California Practitioners Advisory Group, and Board Member Strauss. I'm Joshua Strong. I'm the administrator of the Local Agency System Support Office, or LASSO as we're otherwise referred to. And I'm here to provide you with an update on some required revisions to the Local Control and Accountability Plan. These revisions are kind of twofold. We'll look at them and walk through them item by item. But the objectives for today really are to review the requirements for these revisions to the template and the instructions, as well as the additional supplement to the annual update to the 2021-22 Local Control and Accountability Plan that's also required within Assembly Bill 130. And then to review proposed revisions related to each of these requirements, and then to receive your feedback, listen to your discussion related to these particular revisions. These revisions, as articulated within the item, came about through a combination of Senate Bill 98 in 2020, as well as Assembly Bill 130. And there are 4 required components and one component that the department is recommending based on feedback that we've received from members of the public. And so the revisions here we'll walk through each one of them in order and provide you with some framing, the requirements, and the proposals at this particular point in time. And then after we've gone through all of those, at the end, we'll discuss the revision timeline and the opportunities for further engagement related to these revisions. So the 5 necessary revisions are, first of all, there's a revision required to the instructions for the LCAP template related to Education Code Section 52064E, 5 and 6. These will be referred to as the required goals. There are also changes required to the template, instructions, and expenditure tables for the LCAP in order to address requirements of both Education Code Section 42238.07. That's the section of Ed Code that requires LEAs to provide a demonstration of how they are increasing or improving services for unduplicated students who are low-income English learner and foster youth students. And then also, along with that, 52064B, 6B, and B8, that's the education code that relates to the requirements within the LCAP template and instructions. There are some changes to implement the requirements of Education Code Section, again, 52064B11. This is related to the additional concentration grant add-on amount, the 15% add-on that was included within the Budget Act and within Assembly Bill 130. And then also required by Assembly Bill 130, there's a required supplement to the annual update for the 2021-22 LCAP. And this is a 1-year requirement. It's a completely standalone template. And so everything that's included within that template and instructions is new to the LCAP process. And so that's included in your package as attachment 4. Also, the CDE is recommending replacing the word stakeholder throughout the template and the instructions. This is to remove barriers to engagement based on feedback that we've received from some of our Native American community members throughout the state. And we'll look at that more in a bit. So at this point, we'd like to begin walking through these required revisions. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to walk through them piece by piece, provide you with the requirements, with the proposed revisions as they currently stand, and then give you a chance to provide questions, reflect on the material that we've provided before going on to the next of the required revisions. And we're hoping that this allows for you to be able to provide some input, get some clarification related to the requirements and to the proposed revisions. So we'll begin with the required goals. So again, this is reflective of the requirement that was added to Education Code 52064 as part of Senate Bill 98 in 2020. Originally, this was intended to go into effect with last year's LCAP, but of course, because of COVID and the impact that had on the education system, the LCAP for 2020 was suspended. And so this is required to be part of the revisions for the 2022-23 LCAP. So these particular requirements will go, and these instructions will go into effect as part of the development of the LCAP for 2022-23. So as most of you, if not all of you, are already aware, in general, LEAs have flexibility in determining what goals to include within the LCAP and what those goals will address within the confines of addressing the state priorities through the actions and metrics and the goals that are being provided through the LCAP. Beginning with the development of the 2022-23 LCAP, there is this requirement for LEAs that meet certain criteria to include a specific goal within their plan. And so we'll go over the two goals in order. The first required goal requires that an LEA that has been eligible for assistance based on the performance of the same student group or groups for 3 consecutive years be required to include a goal in their LCAP that focuses on improving the performance of those student groups. So for those of you that spend a lot of time in the education system and are familiar with the term differentiated assistance, this is the assistance based on the performance of those student groups. So essentially, we're talking about an LEA that's been eligible for differentiated assistance based on the performance of the same student group or groups in the dashboard for 3 consecutive years. Now, it's important to note here a couple of things. One, that this is based on the performance of the student group or groups, not based on the same dashboard indicators. So for example, if you have your English learner students that are in 1 year, that cause the LEA to be eligible for one year based on graduation rate and suspension, in the second year based on chronic absenteeism and suspension, and in the third year related to English learner progress and suspension. The fact that it's different indicators in each year is immaterial. This is speaking specifically to the performance of that student group or groups. And the legislative intent here is to ensure that LEAs are addressing those student groups that are consistently low performing throughout the LEA, and ensuring that they are specifically focusing on the needs of those student groups. So within attachment 3, you have proposed instructions for this requirement. Within the instructions, we've provided, first of all, the criteria related to this goal. What is it that would qualify LEAs for this goal? And then secondly, instructions relating to how what the LEA needs to do in terms of this requirement. So this is the first piece of these proposed instructions for this low performing student group required goal. So the criteria that's included within the instructions is an LEA is eligible for differentiated assistance based on the performance of the same student group or groups in the California School Dashboard for 3 or more consecutive years. The instructions related to the required goal is that an LEA meeting that criteria must include a goal in its LCAP that focuses on improving the performance of the student group or groups that led to the LEA's eligibility for differentiated assistance. This goal must include metrics, outcomes, actions, and expenditures that are specific to addressing the needs of and improving outcomes for this student group or groups. The requirement may not be met by combining this goal with another goal. So it's a specific requirement related to a standalone goal to address these low performing student group or groups. So that's the first of the required goals. The second of the required goals is a little bit more wordy and a little bit more complex. And so I'm going to provide the description within the statutory requirement. Then the slide that follows this kind of breaks down the different requirements so that hopefully it's a little bit easier to follow. But acknowledging just upfront that it's a little bit twisty and turny in its path. So Education Code 52064E6 requires that the LCAP instructions be revised to include a requirement that any school district or county office that has 2 or more schools, and one of those schools or more have received the 2 lowest performance levels on all but one of the state indicators on the dashboard for that school receives indicators for 2 or more consecutive years, and the performance level of the students of the all students group within the LEA is at least 1 level higher, has to include a goal, again, a specific goal within the LCAP on how it's going to address the disparities in performance between that school or schools and the district or the county office as a whole. So let's look at it again a little bit more broken out, because again, it's kind of a rabbit trail. So any school district or county office of education with 2 or more schools. So single school districts are not required to include this second goal. This is applicable to any school district or county office that has 2 or more schools. And that's just kind of a minimum requirement. So if the school district or county office has 2 or more schools, then one of those schools or more has to have received the 2 lowest performance levels on all but one of the state indicators on the dashboard for which that school receives performance indicators. So You're going to have certain performance indicators that are applicable to all school districts, all schools. You're going to have certain that are only for elementary school, only applicable to elementary schools, some that are only applicable to high schools. Again, this is looking at the specific indicators that those schools receive. And they have to have received the two lowest performance levels on all but one of the state indicators in the dashboard for 2 or more consecutive years. So those are the first 3 requirements related to this. The third requirement is that the performance of the students at the district or county office as a whole, the all students performance level on the dashboard, must be at least 1 performance level higher on all of those indicators that the school receives indicators for. So we're also comparing the district's performance on those specific indicators with the school's performance on those specific indicators. So an LEA that meets all 4 of those criteria that are included in that first bullet point is then required to include a goal that focuses on addressing the disparities in performance between the school or schools and the school district or the county office as a whole. The legislative intent here is to ensure that a district that is performing well cannot simply overlook a consistently low performing school, and to ensure that within those LEAs that the needs within that particular school or schools are being addressed through that specific goal within the LCAP. So again, proposed instructions for this requirement are on pages 20 and 21 of attachment 3. Similar to the first goal, there is first criteria provided within the instructions. And then secondly, there's the instruction related to the goal requirement itself. So the criteria that's included within the template is the following applies only to a school district or county office of education with 2 or more schools. 1 or more schools within the LEA must or have received the 2 lowest performance levels on all but one of the state indicators for which the schools receive performance levels in the dashboard for 2 consecutive years. And the performance of the all student group for the LEA is at least 1 performance level higher in all of those areas, or all of those indicators. So that's the criteria. The instructions related to this is that a school district or COE that meets the low performing schools criteria must include a goal in the LCAP focused on addressing the disparities in performance between the school or schools and the LEA as a whole. This goal must include metrics, outcomes, actions, and expenditures specific to addressing the needs of and improving outcomes for the students enrolled at the low performing school or schools. This requirement may not be met by combining this goal with another goal. So that's the instructions. Now, before we get to questions and comments, obviously these goal requirements related to both student group performance and school and LEA performance within the dashboard are obviously a little bit difficult to tease out. And so the department, the Student Achievement and Support Division that LASSO, our office is a part of, is coordinating with Cindy Kazanis' accountability unit, AMARD, in order to produce lists using the data in order to identify those LEAs that will be required to include these particular goals within their plan. That information will then be provided, it will be posted, it will be provided to the LEAs as well as to the county offices that those LEAs serve. And we'll be doing some specific training for those LEAs and county offices related to implementing this requirement. So the hope there is that there will be some clarity around which LEAs will be required to include these goals in their plans moving forward, and to ensure that we don't have to have all sorts of chaos and confusion related, especially to determining whether or not an LEA has to do that second required goal, which is really the rabbit trail related to schools. So at this point, I will pause and open it up for any questions that you all might have or clarifications related to the proposed template and instructions.
Thank you, Josh. I'm going to ask a question and then I'll throw it to Kimberly and then I'll watch as the hands go up. I want to say thank you for you translating all these pieces, because I know you did not invent this. So as I was listening to you, I was just getting so, I just had so many emotions about the technicalities. And so I had to remind myself that you did not invent this. And I appreciate all the time that you and CDE and Cindy, when she runs the list, because now we can say there are lists, which we didn't really say before, right? There was criteria and eligibility, but now there's lists. So I just want to say thank you, because I know this was probably one of so many countless meetings you'll have helping folks understand something that you did not create for the world. So thank you, Josh. I wanted to go to your example of the English learner student group and how you said 1 year they could be eligible because of their performance on the graduation suspension. The next year they could be eligible because of the chronic absenteeism suspension, and then English learner progress and suspension. In that example, the goal that has to be created for the English learner student group, do the metrics have to hit all of those indicators that had them eligible over the 3 years? Tell me a little bit more in that example of the English learner group, like what an appropriate goal that meets the instructions might look like, please.
Okay, so essentially, in terms of the goal related to the specific student group or groups, part of that is going to rely on the LEA's data analysis, but also on the stakeholder input related to the needs of that specific student. So for example, and I'll kind of frame this in terms of improvement science and the process of continual improvement. When we're looking at the needs related to those particular students, the dashboard indicators don't actually provide us with what the needs are. They provide us with the outcomes of those students. However, those outcomes of students have underlying needs that are leading to those outcomes. So as part of the LEA's data analysis and the input that they're collecting on stakeholders, it would be appropriate to look at the years in which those student groups led to eligibility for differentiated assistance, look at whether the issues that led to them being eligible have been, whether or not the LEA has included things in past LCAPs to address those particular issues. I mean, that might be part of the reason that we're not seeing the same indicator identified year over year. It fluctuates because the LEA has implemented something in 1 year that has allowed that issue to be addressed, or at least is improving, whereas other things have kind of risen to the top, as which is, to a certain extent, what we're looking to see is that some issues are addressed, those become less of a priority. Other things are raised as a priority in terms of importance based on outcomes. And so it would be looking to see, what have we addressed? What still needs to be addressed? And then how is it that we can, what specific actions and services can we put in place related to this student group or groups that is then going to help them to increase their performance at a faster rate or at a more substantial rate than the other student groups within the LEA.
So if I want to avoid a UCP, I should probably hit every metric for whatever goal I develop for the English. In your example of the English learner group, as an LEA, as a system, I'm thinking I probably better put all of those indicators as metrics for whatever the goal is.
Potentially, I think that the part of this, I think that in terms of addressing in creating a goal that's specific to the performance of a particular student group or groups, in addition to the dashboard indicators, I think that it's also going to be really important to ensure that there is a sufficient level of local data that's included as part of the metrics within that particular goal, in order to be able to show, to provide a realistic appraisal of performance during the year. Part of the problem that we run into with some of the state indicators is that it's not necessarily the most recently available data. And so in order to provide an adequate assessment of whether or not there is an improvement occurring related to that particular student group or groups, I think that including a sufficient amount of local data as metrics is going to be important in order to show that progress that student group or groups are making. And if there's not a show of progress, either through the local data or through the dashboard data, then it's obvious that there's some changes that need to be made to that goal going forward in order to address the specific needs of that student group.
Josh, I'm really glad you talked about local data. And Kimberly, I'll go to your question in just a second. But I think that local data is such a good point, because when I think of what the education world has experienced over the last 18 months, attendance, suspension, they're not really going to tell me how my English learners are doing, right? I'm going to want to dig into what's the reading levels of my English learners coming out of kindergarten on my local assessment that I've bought over the, so I appreciate that local data piece because it makes it feel more relevant to me, especially after hearing colors and dashboard, which I know you had to do. I get it. So I appreciate that, because I truly think without local data, we're not going to be authentically telling the progress or trying to measure the progress of our student groups. So I will stop taking all the airtime and I will throw it to Kimberly. Go ahead, Kimberly.
Thanks. Just somehow I tried to not say this, but I feel like there's a Ted Lasso joke in here somewhere needing to be made. But anyway, my question, to kind of follow on Melanie's question, if a district meets this criteria for two different subgroups, or, for the other goal, if it's more than one school, does it seem like the best practice would be to have one goal per subgroup or one goal per school, rather than trying to combine different groups with different needs into the same goal?
Potentially, and I mean that would certainly be within an LEA's purview as to whether or not they were going to include a goal that's specific to each one of them. I think that in terms of the legal requirements, there's only the requirement for the single goal for all of the schools that would meet that requirement, or all of the subgroups that would meet that requirement. However, in terms of the requirements related to within, or in terms of the way in which the requirement for the goal is articulated in the LCAP instructions as it's currently proposed right now, the LEA would have to include specific metrics related to each subgroup or each school, and would have specific actions related to each subgroup and each school. And so at a minimum, even if it's only one goal addressing multiple subgroups, you're going to see specific actions within each of those plans and specific metrics within each of those goals, not plans, within each of those goals, speaking to each of the identified subgroups that led to the LEA's requirement to include the goal.
All right, great, thank you. And maybe I missed this. So if this is implemented and needs to be done in the 22-23 LCAP that we approve by next July 1st, what year of the dashboard are we using, and when these lists are created, will we be talking about the 2019 dashboard?
I'm afraid, to be quite honest, I don't actually know which years we'll be pulling from, because Cindy is much better than than I am. However, I'll find that out and let you know what years that we would be looking at.
All right, thank you.
Are there any additional questions?
Nope, that's it for right now. Josh, you can keep going. Thank you.
All right.
No, wait, Tarina, do you have your hand? Let's throw it to Tarina.
Sorry, some of the questions were the same, so I was crossing them off, and I was like, wait, I do have a question. So I understand about the years, you'll get back to us, but how do DAS schools fall in with the districts that have DAS schools? How does that, is that going to change anything, or is it still going to be the same?
No, the requirement, this requirement within the template and the instructions would apply to DAS schools as well as non-DAS schools.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so especially, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier in terms of local data, within those DAS schools, it becomes even more important to utilize that local data, since we are talking about populations that typically have a lot of transition in and out of the program, that may be involved in the program for only a limited amount of time. It's going to be really important for them, especially, to ensure that they're making use of their local data, and also input from those stakeholders, those partners that they work with, right? Whether that's behavioral and mental health agencies, or the juvenile court schools, or whoever is involved as part of the work related to those programs, ensuring that there's that they are also being utilized as data points to say, this is the way in which we're seeing positive outcomes for these students based on what's happening within this goal. So utilizing both that local quantitative data, but also the local qualitative data to ensure that there's that demonstration of progress. Because we all know that sometimes it'll take a few years before things that we're implementing within a school-wide or an LEA-wide program start to show up within the dashboard results. And so, in order to be able to have that consistent look at progress being made, that local data is going to be key.
Thank you, Josh.
So much.
Thank you, Trina. Thank you, Josh. I'm going to throw it to Diane now. Go ahead, Diane.
Hi, I had the same, I think, very similar question going with the DAS school issue, and I'm having trouble figuring out how exactly to word this right. So let me see if I can stumble around a bit and get there. The reality of a lot of DAS schools is they don't have, almost by definition, don't have a stable student population. So whatever indicator we're measuring, it doesn't really matter which one, you're not dealing, you keep getting this, the DAS schools consistently are getting the students who have already, prior to getting to the school, missed those indicators. So the school is almost by definition always going to be behind what is expected of other schools. So I guess what I'm saying is that the way this is structured, my expectation would be that DAS schools would always have these goals. Am I understanding that right?
Potentially. Although I think that to a certain extent, it depends on the number of students that the program serves and what the population looks like year to year. Like, for example, my office is responsible for reviewing and approving County Office of Education LCAPs. The majority of those are DAS school programs, providing those court and community schools. And in those instances, you've got some of the county offices whose court and community school program has a fairly stable number of students that they serve. It's not the same students, but it's, a stable number, whereas others of them have a huge fluctuation in terms of the number of students that they serve and the grade levels that those students come from. So in a particular year, they might be eligible based on the performance of their students one year, but not eligible the next year because they simply don't have a sufficient population of those students to generate any sort of indicator. So to a certain extent, that's going to vary more related to the school and the population that it serves than rather than what we would expect to see from your typical school in a regular district. Also, just to follow up earlier, the dashboard, the years that we would be pulling from are 2017, 2018, and 2019. So 17, 18, and 19 in the initial, for 2022, that would be where that data would be coming from.
Great, thank you so much, Josh. If there aren't any more questions, we'll have Josh continue on. Go ahead, Josh. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the next portion that we'll be looking at are revisions to the contributing actions summary table. So as most, if not all of you are aware, the local control funding formula, LCFF, requires that all LEAs throughout California provide evidence in their LCAP for how they are increasing or improving services for students who are low income, English learner and foster youth. They're often collectively referred to as unduplicated pupils because it's an unduplicated count of those students. How those services are being increased or improved for the unduplicated students as compared to services provided to all students. Services must be increased or improved in proportion to the increase in funds that the LEA has received that have been apportioned on the basis of the number and concentration of low income English learner and foster youth students. And within the vernacular, these are oftentimes referred to as supplemental grant funds and concentration grant funds within the funding, the LCFF funding statute. They're referred to as the supplemental add-on grant and the concentration add-on grant because they're in addition to the per pupil base funding that's provided to all LEAs based on the number of the students and the grade level or the grade span of those students. So currently the LCAP template includes an expenditure table, and this expenditure table identifies all of the actions that have been described within the plan and indicated as contributing to meeting the requirement to increase or improve services. The expenditure table also provides the budgeted expenditures that are associated with those actions that are identified as contributing. And the expenditure table itself, in addition to providing the goal number, the action number, the short title, will also provide the scope of that service. It will provide the unduplicated student groups that service or action is targeted to, the locations that those services would be provided, and then a breakdown of the funds that are associated with each of those particular actions. And so we've included the current template and instructions as attachment to this particular table as it appears in the current LCAP are located on page 10. And so at the top of the table, you have a kind of summary of the totals, the total funds that are included, the total LEA-wide, the total for LEA-wide actions, the total for limited actions, those being actions that are being provided specifically to one of the unduplicated student groups, and then the total of school-wide actions. And then you have the individual actions themselves. So you have these various components, and they show the breakout of where these actions are being provided and the funds associated with them. So Education Code 52064B6B requires that there's be some revisions to these summary tables. And there's two particular revisions. First of all, there's a requirement that for each one of these contributing actions, that there be an identification of the full proportionality obligation that's referenced in Education Code 42238.07, which is oftentimes referred to as the percentage to increase or improve services, or the minimum proportionality percentage, MPP, and how that's being met annually through the list of actions and services. It also requires that each action's quantitative contribution towards the proportionality obligation as an expenditure. So we're talking about a quantitative contribution as an amount of money, the dollar amount, or its qualitative contribution as a percentage of increased or improved services be included within the demonstration. And so this proposed adjustment to the contributing summary table is provided in attachment 3, page 10. The instructions for the proposed table are on page 30 of attachment 3. So the first thing that we're proposing to add in this contributing actions summary table is the estimated amount of funding that's apportioned on the basis of number and concentration of unduplicated pupils, and the percentage to increase or improve services. Now, both of these, both the dollar amount and the percentage are already included within the LCAP template. These are actually called out in the increased or improved services section of the template, and it's directly under the heading for that section. So this is something that's already currently part of the template. However, it isn't currently included within the Excel expenditure tables that are part of the template. So part of the proposal here related to the summary table is to add that to the summary table. And then, and I apologize because just in order to meet accessibility compliance, this is a little bit more broken out than it otherwise would be. So we have the same summary of the totals that's included in the current. We have the same proposed or the same actions portion. However, this is proposed, these 3 fields are proposed as new as well. So you have the expenditure quantitative percentage increase, the additional qualitative or quantitative percentage of improved services, and then the total. So this expenditure the expenditure quantitative percentage increase is actually tied to the amount of funding for that action. So based on the amount of funding that's been apportioned and the total funds, there's a formula that then converts this into a percentage, so that there's a percentage of quantitative increase as that the expenditure is generating. Then there's this additional qualitative or quantitative percentage of improved services. So if in goals or in actions where there is a qualitative or quantitative percentage to increase or improve services that's either in place of a dollar amount or in addition to a dollar amount, that's where this is called out. And then there's this total percentage which totals the line. And because this is a little bit weedy and complex, I want to switch to sharing my screen, and I'll make this larger so that you can see the way in which it all flows together, hopefully. So you would have the estimated amount of funds and the percentage called out. You have the summary of the totals. You've got the actions, and then based on the funding, the qualitative percentage increase of an expenditure would be calculated. There would be the additional qualitative or quantitative percentage of improved services. And then this total here is going to sum that. And then these percentages would then demonstrate whether or not the LEA was meeting their required percentage to increase or improve services. One caveat when we're looking at this is, at this point, this is all illustrative. The formulas are still in the development process, so the math doesn't add up. So before Jesse asks, why the heck are we looking at things that add up to more than 100%? That's why. It's because it's for illustrative purposes only, rather than actual working formulas at this particular moment in time. So in terms of that particular piece, with this increased or improved, the change to the contributing actions summary table, we'll go ahead and pause at this point in time and take questions.
Thank you, Josh. I'm going to start with Linda, then I'm going to go to Jesse, and then I'm going to go to Kimberly. So go ahead, Linda, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Josh, for the work and the explanation you're providing. I believe you were going to show something on your screen, but it didn't actually show. Can you want to go back to?
So let me make sure.
It's very, very tiny.
Okay, so let me make it larger. Is that any better?
Let's see, it's showing up as like a little tile, whereas you're large and your screen is very small.
You can you can change the.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, great. And then the question that I had really is, can you share some examples of what would be an example of something that's a quantitative expenditure or something that's a qualitative, action?
So the way in which the education code requirement frames it related to this particular component is that the requirement for the connection between the funds that are associated with a particular action is its quantitative increase. So the way that statute reads, the quantitative increase is tied then to the funding that is associated with that particular action.
So that would mean, for example, a specific expenditure?
Correct. So the dollar amount that's being used in support of that action would be that action's quantitative contribution towards increasing or improving services. Now, that's actually called out within statute as something that has to be expressed as a percentage. And so that's part of the reason that we're converting it into that percentage to show that the LEA is meeting its percentage that it's required to increase or improve services by.
Okay.
In terms of the qualitative, you asked for any examples of that. The qualitative in this particular instance could be and to a certain extent, this is a little bit down to some semantics and definitions, because in general, at least from what I have found, is that a lot of times when we hear we in education hear the term quantitative, we think it's something that can be counted. Whereas when we hear qualitative, we're thinking about a quality increase. However, in terms of just looking at the definitions related to those words, quality is something that they're both things that can be counted or can be measured. It's just in terms of quantity, it's the amount of something versus qualitative, which is the measure of one thing to a similar thing. So when we're talking about a qualitative increase, it could be an improvement in a specific metric, for example. So we started here, we ended 2% higher, or we anticipate that this will lead to a percentage increase of this within a particular metric or perhaps a group of metrics. And that percentage increase in terms of improvement would then be what would be identified as the qualitative improvement related to that action.
So
you could also
can I just to help me understand, would I have to, for example, if I make an estimate that doing something different, perhaps, or augmenting something is going to result in an improvement, qualitative improvement, do I need to specify what it is that I'm doing?
Well, you have to specify what it is that you're doing anyway related to these particular actions and services within the increased or improved services section.
Okay.
If it's being provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis, there has to be a sufficient description within the increased or improved services section of the LCAP of not only how it is that the LEA is utilizing specific actions to address the needs, conditions, and circumstances of its low-income English learner and foster youth students, but it also has to include as part of that description how it is that or what it intends the outcome of that particular action to be, whether that is reflected in an increased performance in one or more particular metrics or say survey results or whatever. But there has to be this connection within the increased or improved services section for actions that are being done LEA-wide or school-wide between how the action is addressing the needs of those students and what it is that it expects to see those things lead to.
So I'm just a hypothetical case. So for example, if I'm, let's say I'm a continuation high school and the graduation rate is not what I want it to be, and so maybe some funds or training that has a certain cost is going to help us improve that, and I would put that under the quantitative section. But if, for example, I was going to do personalized outreach to students, call their homes, visit them, do some kind of approach to working with students that is not a cost per se, but it's an action that could improve the outcome. Would that count as qualitative?
Correct. So just kind of building a little bit off of your example, you have staff and as part of those regular staff duties, they're going to begin doing individualized outreach, maybe in person, door to door, maybe calling or something like that. And this, what you're hoping to achieve through that is an increase in the attendance rate of those students by, say, 5% over what it was, and I'm just throwing that percentage out there.
Well, and that's a great example. Thank you for clarifying that too. How would I go about estimating what's a reasonable percent, or how do I value? In other words, how do I come up with some type of estimate of what the impact of that's going to be?
That's the big question. That's at this point in time, that's part of what we're working through in terms of ensuring that we can provide appropriate training related to this requirement. It's not necessary. What you're bringing up and what you're getting into related to that particular component is less related to the template and more related to the training and ensuring that LEAs and parents and community members have the information that they need in order to be able to make some sort of reasonable determination of that.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I'm glad to hear that'll be part of the training. I think that's a really good step and very good support for folks. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, with that, thank you, Linda. With that, I will pass it over to Jesse. Go ahead, Jesse.
Hi, Joshua. Thank you so much for putting this together. I had sort of the same question as Linda, to tell you the truth. Can you go back to the Excel worksheet really quickly?
Absolutely.
And don't worry, I'm not going to say, oh, this doesn't add up. But really, my question is, you have this expenditure quantitative percentage increase. That's very straightforward, extremely straightforward. Mm-hmm. Where it gets murky for me is the additional qualitative or quantitative percentage of improved services, right? And so when you're saying qualitative of improved services, you're trying to put some sort of impose some sort of quantitative metric on something that's qualitative. That's where I get really kind of messed up. So it would seem that you're asking people to put a quantitative response on something that's sort of perceptive, so to speak, but maybe I'm not following you. That is, this is going to be very specific to the respondent. It's not necessarily going to be cardinal in the sense that, if Joshua puts, a 5% improvement, that might be equal to a 10% improvement for me.
Right.
Right.
This particular piece here, as we've already discussed, is to a certain extent going to fluctuate from LEA to LEA based on what that is, and to be honest, there's going to be a fair number of folks out in the field that are going to be incredibly scared of putting anything in here because it's just really ambiguous at this point in time, and nobody really has a strong understanding of how do we do this. Speaking in terms of what you're referring to, if we're looking specifically at the definition of quantitative versus qualitative, the quantitative is measuring something related to its quantity, the number or amount, rather than its quality. Whereas qualitative is measuring or measured by the same standard as something else. So for example, in this particular piece here, when we're talking about a qualitative percentage of improvement, let's take student benchmark assessment scores in ELA. There is a similar standard of measure for all students. However, we can look at, and remember that this is related to contributing expenditures, so we're focusing specifically on how is this going to provide an increase or an improvement in the services that are being received by students who are low income or English learner or foster youth. So we're looking specifically at how do we anticipate this action leading to a greater increase in the academic outcomes. So the tests scores for our, say, low income students, as opposed to those benchmark test scores for all students. We want those to increase more. We're implementing these actions. In order to do that, we should anticipate seeing that this will raise the low-income students' test scores on our benchmark assessments by this much over what we anticipate it will raise for everybody else. Okay, so that is a qualitative improvement for those students. Now, going back to kind of what we talked about earlier with Linda, how you determine that is still something that is being worked through, not just by us, but by a bunch of people throughout the state as we all try to grapple with this requirement.
Okay, so I think it's going to be really important that this is done consistently within an LEA. That is, you can imagine there might be different people involved in serving the different, the English learner actions or the foster youth actions or, what have you. And so you can come up with very different ways to come up with these percentage of qualitative improvements of services down your rows, right? Or across your rows. And then the other thing that's one concern that I have. The other concern is then that it looks like you want to add columns I and J together to come up with a total percentage. And I'm not sure if this is all worked out yet, or if you wanted to do sort of some sort of weighted scale of those, or if you've thought about that at all. So there's a lot going on here. It's the last thing that I'll say is that your description or your example is a very good one, saying how you expect the improvement for the target population for whom the action is intended. You came up with what you'd expect it to be to boost, say, the low income student scores by 10% more than other students who are not benefiting from this activity. That's great, but that seems like a very quantitative thing to me as well. And it's fine to call it qualitative. I'm totally fine with that. But my concerns is that this is going to be done at least consistently within the LEA, because otherwise, if the way that these activities are ranked or scored qualitatively is all over the map, you're going to come up with kind of a very noisy measure, I think. And especially when you start combining the qualitative percentages of improved services with your quantitative percentage increases. So anyway, I'll stop there, but and you can react or back to Melanie, whatever.
No, thank you for the feedback. I'm not reacting, I'm listening. And my staff is taking notes, so we're good.
Josh, I'm going to use that with my son. I'm not reacting. I'm listening. I might use it with my staff. Okay. Thank you, Jesse, for those thoughts. Thank you, Josh. I'm going to toss it to Kimberly, and then after Kimberly, we'll have Tara, and then we'll go back to Lindsay. So go ahead, Kimberly.
Thanks. I want to add my thanks to the CDE. I know it can be a very difficult job to take legislation and ed code that is sometimes, how should I say, unclear at best, not actually implementable at worst, and then for the CDE to have to write instructions to help districts implement it. Having said that, my main issue, and I have a number of questions. My main issue is that the new columns don't seem to match what I'm reading in the ed code requirements, and the titles of these columns and how they're being used, I think will be extremely confusing to staff who create the LCAP, and also to anyone who's going to be reading it. They're very subjective. And as people have already said, I can say, well, hiring tutors for English learners to, do after school tutoring is an increase of X percent. And someone else will say, well, I think it's that. And I think that arguing over that number really won't be serving anyone's purpose. And this is a significant increase in the amount of work for staff, to have to put that qualitative number on each. Now, again, that is what's in the ed code, although I want to be really clear, the Ed Code says to show the expenditures or the qualitative contribution. It does also talk about, it references our regulations, the California Code of Regulations, which is where you find the calculation to get the overall percentage of increase improved. So in your example, the 8%, how that is calculated is in the Code of Regulations. If we are adding some formula for how to measure qualitative increases on individual action level, it would seem that that kind of instruction should also be added to the regulations. Or again, it will be very subjective, and I wouldn't even think that 3 people in the same district would come up with the same number. But it should be optional. There's no need for districts to have to fill in both the expenditure dollar figure and a quantitative percentage. They should be able to choose. So specifically, can you tell me where the expenditure quantitative percentage column came from? You said that it has to be expressed as a percentages in the Ed Code somewhere. I couldn't find that requirement.
Okay, so in terms of this particular piece in the proposed contributing action summary table, the expenditure quantitative percentage increase in terms of converting the amount of funding associated with the action into a percentage isn't specifically required for this table. Where it is required is in the component that we're going to look at next, related to the determination of whether or not the LEA is going to be required to carry over any of its unused, increased, or improved services requirement from one year to the next year. Because in that instance, the determination of whether or not an LEA has required carryover is determined based on whether or not the LEA has met its percentage, not the funding amount, but the percentage to increase or improve services. In order to do that, it's necessary to convert everything to a percentage so that we're comparing apples to apples rather than doing something else. And so just in the way that the Excel workbook is constructed in order to try to minimize the impact of effort on LEAs, this particular piece was included so that when we get to the contributing annual update summary table, the formulas are already in place downline to calculate those percentages and determine whether or not the LEA has in the current year met its requirement to increase or improve services by that proportionality percentage.
All right. Again, reading the Ed Code, and that's in the 42238.07. It talks about total expenditures. It doesn't talk about total expenditure percentages. So I again think that we're adding complexity. But I'll go on to the next column. Where did this idea of additional qualitative or quantitative percentage come from? It's the word additional that's throwing me here. So again, the Ed Code says in 5264B says, put the expenditure or the qualitative contribution. This seems to be asking for an additional contribution that is on top of the expenditure, or is additional, am I misreading that word?
So the requirement within Education Code 42238.07 related to increasing or improving services. The way in which it's articulated in statute provides that an LEA has the option of increasing services using funding, or you can also increase your services by doing more of something. You can improve your services by having additional, by having a qualitative improvement to an outcome. And so it's conceivable that you would have an action that has a certain amount of funds that are associated with that action. That also, that the LEA, it's not just like the LEA is saying, oh, we're going to put X amount of money towards this, and that's what we're going to do. It's that we're putting X amount of money towards this, and we anticipate that it's going to lead to this qualitative improvement. And so you would have both a quantitative improvement and a qualitative improvement, and the contribution towards meeting that increased or improved services percentage would be the total of both.
So I don't think that's what the Ed Code says, and it's unfortunate that I think the part that we're talking about is I know it's in the next section. I feel like I hear, and maybe one of the examples was given. So if I had existing staff increase their services without any additional compensation, I would be able on this table to say that I have increased services to students without spending any of my S&C money on that action. But, and therefore I would not need to spend that money because I could show, again, I could pick 10 actions and somehow have them add up to, in your example, the 8% increased, and say, look, I didn't even need to spend any of my S&C. Now I can put it towards my base, which as an administrator, I already feel is not large enough. So I think this really gets away from the issue that the state auditors pointed out about not using these funds for the students. I'm not saying that is the intent, but by allowing people to add on things that don't cost anything, you're saving that money and just putting it back into the base and saying, well, we improved the services, so we don't now need to spend that money on the students. That is what it feels to me, and I'm sure there are others who are seeing it the same way. So I see now why you're having additional, again, the Ed Code says, or, it says put the expenditure or the proportional way that you're improving services as a percentage. So it's very similar to at the top of this chart that you're showing, where it's like there's $125,000, or we're calling that an 8% increase. They're the equivalent of each other. But you're not that's what the Ed Code is saying, please demonstrate in these tables. And that's not what we're adding here. So it feels like there should be another column that actually meets the Ed Code requirement of expressing the qualitative percentage of increased or increased services of each action. But again, that should be optional. And I hope that this will change, because I'm going to say again, very confusing to both the writers and the readers, decreasing transparency. And I don't believe it's following Ed Code. Although I will say that the Ed Code appears to have been hastily written, and perhaps this is why we shouldn't do Ed Code and trailer bills. We should actually do it through the legislative process. All right. A question. Do any of these new columns talking about expenditure quantitative percentages or the additional percentages of qualitative or quantitative, are those using any of the funds other than LCFF? Because again, on this table, we have LCFF funds and total funds.
What do you mean using the funds?
Well, so let's say that I'm doing an action and I'm half funding it from LCFF supplemental and concentration and half from Title I. And it's improving things by a significant percentage. But again, half of it is not being funded to meet these pieces of ed code. I'm using other money to supplement. When I calculate the percentage of improved services or the quantitative percentage increase, am I showing either the Title I funds that I'm using for that service or the effect of the Title I's 50% being used for that service in here, so that I'm claiming that I'm meeting my percentage for LCFF purposes with other funds?
So in this particular table, the amount, the percentage that would be captured within column I in terms of what at this point is labeled the quantitative percentage increase is calculated based on the LCFF funding. Because actions and services, only the portion of an action or service that is funded out of LCFF funding is what is attributable to towards meeting the requirement to increase or improve services.
And the same for the additional qualitative or quantitative?
The additional qualitative or quantitative wouldn't be based on funding. It would be based on outcomes.
Right. So if I provide a service and pay half and half with LCFF in Title I, and it produces a 10% increase in quality, half of that is attributable to my Title I funding. Are you saying that I should include all 10% in that column or only 5%? Again, because if I'm going to add that up and use it to determine if I'm meeting my proportionality requirements, it would be using non-LCFF funds.
That, to a certain extent, would depend on whether you are collecting data on which part of the service was provided using Title I funds and which part was provided using LCFF funds.
Right. I guess I'm asking that the instructions be extremely clear that any calculations for any of these three columns exclude any improvement that is due to non-LCFF supplemental and concentration funding, or else it would seem against statute. My next question is the very first part. You said the contributing table, the first obligation, I think, was to show that the district is meeting their full obligation. So I think you had the 8% and the 125,000. So how does this table meet that requirement? How is it showing that the district is meeting that?
The idea with the table is that the total percentage here would then correlate to this percentage here. So basically, the percentage that's provided within this column would show how much of these each of these actions is then contributing towards meeting this percentage.
So there's going to have to be a total for that column, and then where would that appear on the page? Would it be the top box? on the right-hand side?
It would make the most sense to either put it somewhere here next to the percentage or to include it somewhere over here with the other totals.
All right. I'll be very interested to see how we add up completely different percentages that aren't related to each other to get one number that we can then compare to that 8%. And a question. So on that top left-hand corner, my request would be that if we're going to show the total amount apportioned on S&C, and show the percentage, which is the result of the calculation where we take S&C divided by the base, less TIG and targeted, less TIG and transportation, that we actually show the dollars of the base right underneath so that people have both the numerator and the denominator of the equation that gets us to that 8%. That just seems like it would be helpful and transparent so that they don't think that 8% is being plucked out of the air. So that would be a request. And then again, my proposal is that we add one column for qualitative percentages for each item that's an optional fields, which is what this section of the Ed Code requires. And we can talk more about how we get to the annual table when we get to that item. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. We are going to throw it to Tara, and then after that, we will go back to Linda. Go ahead, Tara.
Great. Thanks. And I think I just want to echo some of the same questions that we heard from Jesse and Linda and Kimberly about, and maybe you could scroll back over to the columns, in particular, the column on additional qualitative or quantitative percentage of improved services. And I think this is all super complex and I appreciate you explaining it in the ways that you have and all of the thinking that's gone into it. And I think, I am still processing. I'll just lay that out there. But going back to Kimberly's example of the continuation high school and improving services by improving the frequency of outreach. First, it seems like you could take that example and put numbers on it in terms of the increased staff time that will cost to do. But if you think about it as an improvement of services, I guess I'm struggling with your example of projecting ahead to think about how that action might, say, improve test scores. And it seems like guessing what that improvement is going to be and putting it into column J versus, if you need to quantify it there, quantifying it by we used to call families or call students, once a month, and now we're going to call them once a week. And that is a quantitative improvement in services that maybe you could get here as a percentage. But I guess I'm struggling with the focus on outcomes rather than how the services are being improved on the front end on the inputs for these students.
Okay.
Okay, now I'll go to Linda.
Thank you. I want to go back to really back to the original legislation for LCFF and funds, where the term increase or improve came from. And I'm wondering if we are using it in the way that is consistent with that terminology, because in the original bill, it was the use of the supplemental concentration funds to increase or improve services. But what I'm seeing here, maybe I don't understand it well, but what I see is the use of LCFF funds to increase services or some other non-LCFF funded action that improves the quality of services. And that is not the way it was expressed in terms of it was the use of the money to either to increase services or to improve them. So for example, as we've been talking about the example of a continuation high school, with more frequent outreach or people visiting homes, there's probably a cost to that. You know, if you're going to pay people to make home visits, you know, that's a little bit different. But my concern is if we don't stick to the original use of the language, which is these funds, which will have the impact of increasing or improving services, and instead say these funds can be used, we can document use of the funds to increase the services, and then non-funded actions to improve the services, I think we run the risk of not ensuring that the total package of funds is being used. So, for example, if we have to have, you know, what was it, 8 or 9%, and we're saying, I can't see right now. Let me blow this up again. If we're saying that we're supposed to have like an 8% increase, and all that is funded out of LCFF, and in that first line, it is true, that is what's happening, and this additional is just over and above, which is fine. But what if I were saying, you know, I actually needed a 10% increase overall, and 8% of it I got out of use of funds, and the other 2% I'm being allowed to account for that, but I don't have to demonstrate that I'm paying for it out of LCFF funds. And that to me concerns me, because then those funds, the full amount of funds that are supposed to be dedicated to this project, aren't being expended. They're being offset by non-funded activities, which may be very good and well-intentioned and maybe even very effective. But it's not the use of the funds the way the funds work. It does not require right now the total amount of funds to be demonstrated that they're being used. And so maybe there's a way that that's seen someplace else. And, you know, if so, if you can help me understand it, that would be great.
So the requirement within 42238.07 is, and within the regulations, is to demonstrate that how the LEA is increasing or improving services in proportion to the increase in funding generated by those students. There isn't actually any sort of spending requirement related to that. It's related to whether or not there's a sufficient demonstration of how the LEA is meeting that requirement to increase or improve services for those students.
But in proportion means, it refers to a certain percentage of the funds received. So there is a dollar amount there.
There is a dollar amount there that generates that proportional percentage.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of demonstrating whether there's been an increase or an improvement in services, there's not necessarily, statute doesn't necessarily include a clear connection between those.
So maybe the question I'm raising should be better framed as how in these different ways of reporting, how is it demonstrated that the LEA is using their supplemental concentration funds for the students for whom they need to improve and increase services, basically for the students that they're who generate the funds, basically.
Could you restate the question?
Sure, I'll try my best here. So if I'm a district and I've got a large percentage of students who, by their presence, generate a certain amount of supplemental concentration funds, right? And I know what that dollar amount is. And as I'm beginning, and now I as a district, or I've got schools in my district that are not doing as well as I want them to do, and so they're under the differentiated assistance. Where and how do I show that, in fact, in my attempts, my efforts to change the outcomes for students, to improve them, to increase or improve these services that I'm giving the students, that I'm actually spending the proportional amount of money that I received to support these students?
So there's a combination of things. One, there's going to be the required descriptions within the demonstration section of the LCAP about how the LEA is using specific actions and services to address the needs of those unduplicated students, and how that then is intended to improve particular outcomes for those students. That's also going to be called out within the funding associated with each of those actions. Then in addition to that, you also have the annual update that's going to show what the estimated actual amount of funding that was used in each of those actions is, as well as reporting the progress made towards each of the metrics included within the goal. And
but in this set of documents that a district is going to be generating, where is it in here? Because you're right, it's in the general gap. It's there.
Where is what? I'm trying to figure out what exactly it is that you're looking for.
Well, it's back to, I think Jesse made a point, and Jesse, I hope I'm restating it correctly, about what when we use the qualitative category to assume that it's having a certain percentage of impact towards our whatever we need to do, our percentage increase in services or expenditures. Do we run the risk, or is there any way to show that we're still actually making or allocating the expected percent of dollars? Or are we running the risk that if somebody believes something is going to have a very non-funded, but it's a good quality, let's say action or service, and somebody believes this will have a truly positive impact on our students, so this is where we're going to focus our energies, and we're not actually going to need to or choose to use the funding that we're receiving for improving the services for these kids, because we actually believe that this other non-funded activity is going to do it for us. And they may be right, but there still is the expectation that the funding actually be spent for the students as well.
So at least in terms of that, the requirement is that the LEA demonstrate how it intends to meet this percentage right here, not how it intends to spend the funding.
Mm-hmm.
So the LEA is going to demonstrate how it is meeting this percentage. They can meet that requirement relative to the amount of LCFF funds that are associated with that as a simple, math equation,
yeah.
Or it can be demonstrated through both the funding as well as improvements that both count towards that percentage.
And what if the way I divvy that up, let's say I have to show an 8 or 10%, let's say 10%, and I divvy it up that 8% of my improvement is going to come out of money and 2% is going to come out of a qualitative approach that I'm going to do. Or what if I flip it? What if I thought that the 2% was coming out of the money and 8% was coming out of the qualitative? How do I know as a parent? How do I know as a district person that that's the right split? How do I know? And then what happens if I decide that it's only 2% of the money that I actually have to use, or 2% gain that I'm going to get out of the money? Am I using enough of the money? Maybe I should be getting more gain. It seems to me there's just a lot of questions and a lot of what Kimberly brought up, there is certainly a need for greater clarification, maybe more examples of how to do this once there's the training. But I think people will struggle with how to assign a percentage. A percentage of dollars is easy to figure out, you're right. But finding the balance and determining what is the percentage of something that's qualitative. Is it just going to be the remainder if I take my expenditure column away from the total? Or, what is going to be the best way to help us as, to help the school think through what needs to happen and what are the costs associated with that and what are the qualitative input of it. I think it's very, very, very challenging for folks to come to those numbers in a way that is clear. I also wonder about, well, then what happens at the end of the year or so if let's say the percentage of improvement in students, whatever the indicator is, does not match what they anticipated. Did they get the numbers wrong? Did they estimate wrong? Do they need to, I don't know what the criteria are for exiting, but I think the more that we can think through, get some samples out there to really work through, a couple different scenarios so that we can help people figure out how's the best way for them to think through and come up with the percentages in the table and the use of funds for different things versus the use of more qualitative, non-funded types of activities and what's feasible for them. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. I'm going to throw it to Diane. Go ahead, Diane. And remember, folks, we don't have to come out of this meeting trained on the LCAP. And I know all of you know that, and you all are very smart and have very good questions. But I also, because I kind of got some anxiety. I'm like, I got to go train my county office on this LCAP. So just maybe projecting, but don't feel like you have to come out. But I think that was also good feedback, Linda, on what you want to see in the training, because I know county offices, CDE, all of our partners out there will, be thinking about how to train. So I appreciate folks giving that feedback on that too. With that, I will toss it to Diane. Go ahead.
I'm echoing, I think. I have some of the same concerns that have been expressed about how these percentages work and how to talk about them. And for my thing, there's a question about, okay, a school or a group has been identified as belonging in this based on the stuff that we talked about earlier. But if I'm just using an example you have up there, let's say I have English learners and it's a good group of English learners that are needing some sort of improvement in the program. And by some miracle or another, I get a gift as a school of a chunk of money specifically for English learners. So I have no need for LCAP funds for that to get the improvement that I need to do. So how do I note that? How do I, if I'm not going to use LCFF funds, but I have something that has been identified as requiring improvement, it seems real difficult to me to figure out how can I say that I'm improving this thing, but I'm not using these funds to do that in all these percentages that we're playing around with. So, and then does that, what does that do to this balance booking thing of funds itself? I don't know, Josh, I'm not sure I'm really asking you a particular question so much as I think it needs to be really clean of an understanding of this group's been identified as needing to be improved. Now, am I obligated to use LCFF funds to improve that group, or am I obligated to make the improvement? Which are two very different questions in my mind.
Right. So just for clarification and related to the requirements, sometimes there's confusion around the phrase to improve services or to increase services, especially within the LCAP. It's one thing to say, okay, this legal requirement, there's this legal requirement within California that says that each LEA has an obligation to increase or improve services specifically for its students who are low income English learner and foster youth. That doesn't always translate really well when you're talking with your community related to the plan, because in general, when the parents within a district hear this is how we're increasing or improving things, it's related to a whole bunch of different things. It might be related to needs related to a certain ethnic group or a certain intellectual group or students with disabilities or things like that, right? And so to a certain extent, there's this disconnect that exists between the statutory requirements to increase or improve services and the term increase or improve services just within the plan. However, specific to the requirements to increase or improve services for students who are low-income English learner and foster youth, in order to be counted towards contributing to increasing or to meeting that increased or improved services requirement, the action has to have LCFF funds associated with it. You can't have an action within the contributing table that has a 0 in the LCFF funds column and other funding here and have in the total funding column and have it include a quantitative percentage towards meeting that MPP requirement, that percentage to increase or improve services. You can have a qualitative increase where there's no funding associated with the action, but if there's funding involved, it has to include LCFF funding or it can't count towards contributing to increasing or improving services.
Yeah, and like I said, I just think that needs to be so clear because it looks like that what you're saying in the first is we have these things that we need to improve, and then we have this funding bundle, and then I'm supposed to come up with a percentage of improvement, and it's the connection isn't clear, I guess is what I'm saying. So it just needs some tweaking language-wise or something.
Thank you, Diane. We are going to take a little break. Even though I said we weren't in the beginning, we're going to take a little break. So we're going to do 15 minutes. It's about 11 o'clock. So we'll come back at 11:15, and then we will go right into Ron's question and Jorge's question. And we need to reestablish a quorum. So I will pass it over to Sarah to do a quick roll call.
Thank you, Melanie. Melanie Green.
Here.
Ed Monsala. Jorge Aguilar. Ron Anaya.
Here.
Lucy Battle Holt.
Here.
Mia Cooper.
Here.
Diane Grosjean.
Here.
Joanne Iskin.
Here.
Linda Kaminsky.
Here.
Billy Kenny.
Here.
Tara Kinney.
Here.
Jesse Levin.
Here.
Trina Small.
Here.
Janelle Woodward.
Here.
All right, we have a quorum. Go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Sarah. And with that, I will toss it to Ron. Go ahead, Ron, with your question.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks, Josh, for clarifying this document. It's I'm finally starting to understand it, and thank you, Melanie, for the breakdown. Let me organize my thoughts. Been a lot of very good points made by our group today. Kimberly, you made so many great points. That's really where I started to wrap my head around what we're looking at here. Some of the points, though, that really stood out to me when Jesse was talking about assigning a percentage of something qualitative that's tied to an expenditure and not outcomes has really stuck with me, because it's that one pesky column that we keep talking about. It's problematic for me as well. And like Linda had mentioned, if some districts might use that qualitative column as a filler for a lack of either wanting to spend funds or funds available or something that builds that number to meet the right percentage of LCFF funds available. It all seems very complicated. And I know in some parts here I'm repeating what's already been said, in fact, literally quoting what's been said. But if it's this difficult for us to understand after a couple of hours of conversation, I'm concerned about parents and community members as far as their understanding, because especially with this qualitative piece of it, we have there could be a true qualitative improvement in a program and what an LEA is doing, just based on having a program they put in last year going into its second year and just the experience. So we'll see some improvement there without an increase necessarily in expenditures or funds being spent. But it's that column just seems very subjective, where we're trying to do an A plus B equals C, where it almost feels like the funding that's there, and then this intangible. So we're adding money to an intangible measure to meet requirements. And I know it's not focusing on outcomes per se in this particular spreadsheet, but that it gets so confusing there. It makes me scared as far as accountability to our community, accountability to our parents and our students. And it seems to kind of give cover for somebody to put something in a column to make sure that the numbers match up, and allows them to meet requirements without a focus necessarily on what's being spent and what's being done to help our students in need.
Thank you, Ron. Jorge, I saw your hand up, but then I saw it go away. Do you still have a question? No. Okay, great. And with that, Josh, go ahead, continue on.
Okay. So thank you very much. Appreciate the feedback and the input. And so the next piece that we're moving into is in terms of this carryover of increased or improved services, which I think to a certain extent speaks to the concern that you just vocalized, Ron, as well as what others have vocalized as well. So one of the okay. So one of the requirements that's been added in Education Code Section 52064B8 requires the template to be revised to include a couple of different things. There are two new calculations that were added to Education Code 42238.07. And so those need to be provided. And then if it's applicable to the LEA, a description of the specific actions and related expenditures that are going to be implemented using any carryover funding. That includes a demonstration that the planned uses of those funds are going to satisfy the requirements for specific actions to be considered as contributing towards meeting the increased or improved services requirement, which is a really long way of saying that any actions or services that are used in the coming year's LCAP and are using this carryover are subject to the same criteria as any other contributing action, meaning that there has to be an inclusion of how those actions are addressing the needs of low-income English learner and foster youth students within the increased or improved services section, as well as being included as part of the contributing expenditures table and everything else that has to be done for a contributing action that's not using this portion of carryover. So let's talk about the two required calculations that are articulated in Education Code Section 42238.07C 1 and 2. So the first calculation is to calculate the total difference between the total budgeted expenditures for planned actions that are identified as contributing towards increasing or improving services and the total estimated actual expenditures for those actions as reported in the annual update. So we're taking the total of those budgeted expenditures for the actions that were identified as contributing in the LCAP and comparing that to the estimated actual expenditures for those actions that are reported in the annual update. The second calculation is only required to be completed if the total budgeted expenditures for those planned contributing actions are less than the estimated amount of funds apportioned on the basis of the enrollment of foster youth, English learners, and low-income students. So if that's the case, then the LAA has to do this calculation. They have to determine the total percentage point difference, if any, between the total planned quality improvements based on the specific actions and the total actual quality improvements for those actions that are reported in the annual update. So again, you know, it's a little bit of a rabbit trail. In order to address these requirements, what's being proposed is the addition of a contributing actions summary table or contributing actions annual update summary table. So at this point in time, most, if not all of you are familiar with the annual update in the LCAP. The annual update table, similar to the expenditure tables, is going to provide the goal, the action, the description. It's going to provide whether or not the action was identified as contributing in the previous year, and then what the planned amount of funding for that action was, and what the estimated actual amount of funding for that action was. And so it provides that accounting back and forth between what was planned, what was actually what's actually been expended. This contributing actions annual update table would kind of build on that concept and would move the actions that were included within the contributing actions table into their own annual update. So again, there would be this accounting of what was planned, what was actually implemented or actually expended related to that. And then if the amount of funds that were going back up to the determination here for the calculation, if the funds, the total budgeted expenditures for those planned actions was less than the amount of the funding that's apportioned, then they would have to also include the estimated actual percentage increase for those actions and services. So this particular thing can be found on page 12 of attachment 3. The instructions can be found on page 30. And the next few slides just kind of walk through the various components of this. And then in a moment, what I'll do here is I'll put back up the actual Excel table because it just ties things together in a better way. So we can walk through the different portions of that. So before we go into what the particular instructions are here, the contributing actions annual updates table would, similar to the annual update table, have the goal, the action, the title, and I'll make this bigger as I did previously. The goal, the action, the title, whether it was contributing, the planned expenditures for contributing actions, the estimated actual expenditures for those actions, the calculated estimated actual percentage increase, and then the total planned quality or qualitative or quantitative percentage improvements that we looked at in the last table, the estimated actuals, and then the total estimated actual of increased or improved services. Then this total estimated actual of the increased or improved services is intended to tie back. So you would have last year's total planned percentage to increase or improve services, the total estimated actual percentage to increase or improve services, the difference between those percentages, and then if there's a difference between those percentages where the planned percentage to increase or improve services is greater than the total estimated actual percentage of increased or improved services, then there's going to be a required carryover amount that's going to be expressed as a dollar amount of an unused portion of this the funding generated by those students. So in terms of the actual instructions, the only actual piece of instruction that goes into the table is for LEAs to provide the estimated actual additional qualitative or quantitative percentage. Again, only if that's required. And so then they would do that there. And then if there's if within that expenditure table, that annual update expenditure table, there's an identified amount of funds that has to be carried over, we're proposing to add an additional component to or column to the table in the increased or improved services section of the LCAP template, where that required carryover of the unused portion of funds would be specifically identified. So it would be clear to anybody looking at the plan what that, if there was any carryover required and what that amount was. That'll be clearly identified within the template there. And then in addition to those calculation components and the reporting of the estimated actuals in terms of funding and potentially in terms of the percentage increase in or improvement in services. There's also a requirement to update the template to include a description of the specific actions that are the LEA is implementing using any carryover funding, and to provide that as part of the demonstrations. So it would be within the increased or improved services section. And so we're proposing the inclusion of an additional prompt within that section on attachment 3 in your item. It's on page 6. The instructions are on page 29. So the proposed prompt for that description is a description of how any unused portion of the increased apportionment based on the enrollment of foster youth, English learners, and low-income students will be used to increase or improve services for those students in the coming year. The instructions are more in-depth. So an LEA that has required carryover of the unused portion generated by unduplicated students, as identified in the contributing actions annual update summary table, must describe the specific actions and related expenditures to be implemented using the identified unused portion of funds, apportioned on the basis and the number of concentration of unduplicated students from the current LCAP year. This description must include the required demonstration that the planned uses of these funds satisfy the requirements for specific actions to be considered as contributing towards meeting the increased or improved services requirement, including requirements for actions being provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis as applicable to the LEA. The actions to be implemented using the identified unused portion of the increase in funds, apportioned on the basis of the number and concentration of unduplicated pupils, must be provided in addition to the LEA's required demonstration of how it intends to meet the proportional obligation to increase or improve services for unduplicated pupils over and above the level of service provided to all pupils in the coming LCAP year. So I know that there was a lot of content there and it's pretty dense. So at this point, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions, comments, etc.
And Josh, just so that we're clear, just questions, there's no specific part for feedback. You just want to hear just if folks have questions.
Correct.
Okay.
And if we can clarify anything.
Clarifying questions. Remember, we don't have to be trained on this by the end. Go ahead and let me pass it to Kimberly. Go ahead.
So you want the questions and feedback separately in 2 different parts, or you just want it all at once?
I think, oh, sorry, Josh.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it would be helpful if we could do clarifying questions right now and give everybody a chance for that. And then if there's feedback, we certainly are open. That's what this space is for. And I also want to remind everyone that everyone also has the opportunity to submit feedback in writing as well.
All right, I'll raise my hand separately then to give feedback. My first question, Ed Codes, I think it was B8. It says to include the calculations, the first and the second calculation. Can you tell me where we're showing the first calculation, which is the total budgeted expenditures minus, or I'm sorry, yes, the total budgeted expenditures minus the total actual expenditures and showing the result? Where on the form is that?
So pulling up this, so the first required calculation is the estimated actual expenditures for contributing actions that would then be totaled and would be in. So the total of this column here, the estimated actual expenditures, would need to be probably up here next to the estimated amount of additional funds. So basically, we'd include a total column here and move all of this, the rest of this over.
All right, let's be clear though. So it says last year's, the column that has 125,000 at the top, says last year's estimated amount of funds generated. So that's how much your district was apportioned. It doesn't necessarily have to equal the amount that you budgeted in your LCAP. And by the June of the following year, because again, this is for the prior year, isn't the apportioned amount much more solid? Because, you know, this is the part of the problem with LCAP is that it's calculated for that year's unduplicated students, which you don't know when you've generated the LCAP prior to school starting. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's the amount apportioned, there's the amount you budgeted in the LCAP you wrote a year ago, because this is the annual update, and then there's the actual estimated expenditures. Those are three different numbers, and the ones in calculation one would be a total of the one that says last year's planned and estimated actual expenditures, two that are on the bottom, E and F, and I don't see either of those totals at the top. And I don't see the difference between them as a physical number saying, so it's not just put the two components of the calculations, it's do the calculation and show the results. And that seems to me to be what the Ed Code's asking for. So I didn't see that. So sorry if that's both a question and feedback.
Thank you.
I mean, I guess your question, your point on if your apportionment amount is not less than what you budgeted, this is calculation 2, then you don't have to do a bunch of work. And I'll just say that it feels to me as though the Ed Code was actually written incorrectly, because it introduces a third topic when all of the other Ed Codes talking about 2. But you're saying that some of this is optional if that's not true for your district?
So the way that 422 3807 reads, C2 reads, it says, if the total budgeted expenditures on planned actions reported in the LCAP is less than the estimate described in the estimated amount of funding, then you have to determine the difference.
Right.
If it's not, then you don't have to.
All right. And I'll share that, last year when we wrote if we had written an LCAP last spring, the May revise that we went on in terms of budget figures had very small numbers for S&C, and indeed for all LCFS, because that's when we were looking at a decrease in a negative COLA. So if we had done an LCAP last year, the amount we would have apportioned into our LCAPs and the amount we would have planned for would have been a certain number. As the year progressed and the budget was approved, those amounts increased by quite a bit. So luckily we hadn't written our LCAPs. But my point would be that in any given year, the amount you budget when you are doing this prior to final state budget being allocated doesn't necessarily reflect what you end up with as an apportionment. And so I just want to be really clear that the top thing for column D, last year's estimated amount of additional funds generated, at some point your apportionment becomes final, and that should be approaching a final number when you're approving this plan for the prior year by July 1. And so that number is often going to be different. And so I'm not even sure that it should say estimated. Again, it feels like we know that apportionment. So sorry, again, a little feedback and with a question. This question is, your memo and your PowerPoint covered most of the new language in the Ed Code, but you didn't cover the language in paragraph D. And it's extremely confusing, but it kind of gets to why we're adding things together. Can you help us understand that paragraph? Because again, it wasn't included in any of the materials. Or can you read it? Or do you want me to read it?
Can you be more specific in terms of paragraph D?
So 42238.07, section D. If the total estimated actual expenditures and the total actual quality improvements are less than the total budgeted expenditures and the total planned quality improvements, and together these efforts are less than the total increase or improvement in services, then we have carryover. And I think that very, very, very poorly written paragraph that says, please add some dollars and some percentages together and then determine if somehow they equal more than a percentage is what's leading to a lot of the confusion. I just didn't understand why it wasn't included in any of the documentations where you actually give us most of the other ed code.
Because so in this particular instance, the item and the revisions and things like that are all related to the LCAP template and instructions. That particular portion is not actually something that is articulated as needing to be included in the template and instructions. What is required to be included in the instructions in the LCAP template are the two calculations and a description of the specific actions and related expenditures using those carryover funds. So in terms of the actual process of doing the calculations and determining whether or not there is an unused portion of that funding that not actually part of the template and the instructions, and so wasn't included. In terms of practicality, that calculation that's expressed in D is a mechanism that the proposed annual update or contributing annual update table does within summing the funds, the percentages, and then doing the math itself to determine what the difference is between the total planned percentage and the estimated actual percentage, and calculating based on that percentage whether or not there's any carryover and what that carryover is.
Right. So it's driving the addition of the quantitative percentage, which isn't actually in ed code anywhere, but it could be one interpretation of that paragraph. It drives the additional qualitative, quantitative column. It drives the idea that they would be added together. So it drives many of the columns that are being added to both this table and the one in the prior topic of the contributing. So again, it's very important because it's behind the entire structure of how we're changing both of these tables. So I just thought it was interesting that I didn't understand why it wasn't there. And I guess the last question is, and you may have already said this, so where are the detailed instructions on how to calculate a percentage for a quality improvement, and then the instructions for how to take an expenditure and change it into a percentage at an action level? I think you've said those aren't done yet. Is that true?
So there aren't actually any instructions for that. That would be training. That would be part of the guidance part of the training that goes into this template.
All right, that's my question. So I guess I'll just raise my hand and go to the back for feedback. Thank you.
Linda?
Thank you. And Josh, thank you for all you're doing to help us try to understand this. I appreciate it. Could you put up the table that you just had up a second ago? I'm sure my question is very, very basic here. Can you help me understand? I see at the top, a couple rows, row 2 and 3, I see where we're ending up with a dollar amount of required carryover. Where does it show that that dollar amount is added to the new amount of money coming in for the future year?
It doesn't. That money does not get added to the amount for the future year.
Okay. Well, obviously they're not going to give it twice. So let's say I have $100,000 left over, and next year I'm getting, $300,000. As a district, I know I have $400,000 of funds that I should be deciding what's the best use of them. But on this table down below, where am I talking about what I'm doing with that $100,000? Or am I putting it right in with the other $300,000? I don't see a heading that says, kind of the use of the carryover or anything. So okay. I'm not sure if it's all or it's called out.
Right. So basically, this summary table here, the contributing actions annual update summary table, essentially allows the LEA to provide, if necessary, provide an estimated actual additional qualitative percentage. That's the only thing that they would have to add on this page. Everything else would actually be added on other tabs down here. For example, the estimated actual expenditures would all be added in on the annual update summary table. So you're going to have the expenditures that are for contributing actions that are basically going to pre-populate in this table based on what the LEA enters in this table. Now, this number, this amount here, if there's an amount that's identified here, is then going to go to the LCAP template and is going to be inserted here in this required carryover. And so that dollar amount, if an LEA has a dollar amount there, it'll have to add that dollar amount, put that dollar amount here so that anybody looking at the plan can see here's the percentage to increase or improve services for the coming year. Here's the increased apportionment amount for the coming year. Here's the required carryover from the current year. And then that description that you were talking about is down here. How any unused portion of the increased apportionment, so these specific funds, are going to be used to increase or improve services for foster youth, English learners, and low-income students in the coming year. So then this is where that description would be, in addition to those actions and their descriptions being included here within the actions and services and goals and things like that.
Okay, could you go back to the second to last place that you were, where you were just showing me?
Right here?
Yeah. Okay, so basically the third box down is how you're planning on using the unused portion of the prior year. Is the fourth box the upcoming year?
No. These two boxes right here are the current year. And that's the way that it is in the LCAP template at this point. So this would be for the current year, how you're using the funding for the coming year, or how you're meeting that requirement for the coming year. This is how you're using the carryover funding here to finish meeting your obligation from the current year, and how you're doing that in the current year. This part here is actually related to the concentration grant add-on amount.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, and then if you could go now to the page that breaks down in terms of the actions?
Within the LCAP template?
Yes, please. The one you just showed it a second ago.
Okay. So right here.
Yeah, okay. So what part of that aligns to the use of the carryover funds? Or is it all put together at this point now?
So essentially what it would be that the LEA identifies that it has carryover.
My $100,000 that I carried over.
Yep, exactly. So here's your $100,000. So as part of your plan within the goals and actions that you as the LEA have developed, or maybe even you're going to create a complete separate goal just for the carryover. You don't have to, but you could. Mm-hmm. You're going to have certain actions that are within the plan that are utilizing the carryover funds in order to increase or improve services for foster youth English learners, low-income students. Within this description here, you're going to provide a description of, one, what actions are being used to meet this requirement. Okay, so in goal 1, actions 2 and 3, goal 2, actions 7 and 4. And then you're going to be providing that explanation of how these actions are meeting the needs of those, or seeking to address the needs of those unduplicated students, and how you anticipate that will increase or improve services for them. And then these actions that are up here within the goals and actions in the LEA's plan for the coming year are then going to show up in the contributing actions summary table for that year, and are also going to be reported in through the annual update and everything else. So they're going to basically be treated at that point as an action or actions within the plan, and they're going to go through the process, the same procedure as all of the other actions in the plan. However, they're using those specific carryover funds in order to implement them.
Is there any kind of requirement that I use those funds, or that I delineate how I'm using the funds for each of the particular subgroups?
Foster you mean in terms of English learners, foster youth, and low income? No.
So how do we, and yet they were generated by those kids, right? So how do we know that those kids are getting kind of their fair percentage of those funds?
Well, you have to use those funds in actions that are contributing towards increasing or improving services for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You can't just take the funds and use them in some sort of general all-purpose action.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. Now I'll toss it back to Kimberly. Go ahead, Kimberly.
I did have an additional question, so Josh, help me understand. So are you saying that the actions for the carryover funds will appear, so this is prior year funds, will appear in the actions of my moving forward for next year's LCAP and be on the contributing table for that following year?
Yep.
And so they'll get added into the total that I'm spending, but they're not there at the top as part of the amount that I'm required to spend? Or do they need to be separated somehow?
So
if I get, in Linda's example, she has 100,000 carryover. She's getting 300 the next year. Her obligation is to spend 400. But in the calculations for that new year, she has to show that she's spending the 300 and the corresponding proportional percentage. And if throwing in the 100 as an expenditure would kind of throw that whole thing off. Do you see what I mean?
I think so.
Well, should I give feedback now or should I let other people ask questions?
Yeah, go ahead. Feedback, please.
You can just finish your thoughts. Go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So my feedback would be that the use of the carryover funds should be included as specific individual actions in your going forward LCAP and not just as a prompt on the increased improved services page. It sounds like that's what you want to do. I also was thinking that they should also be on the contributing tables, but then you get kind of the circular thing where now you have 2 years on your contributing tables. And I think once you start getting into comparisons and totals, that will be confusing. But I do think, I think it's great if we're going to not only have them in answer to the prompt, here's how I'm spending that $100,000 of carryover, but they're incorporated into the actions in the main part of your plan under the goals. I think that aligns with what the words of the Ed Code say in terms of all new actions plus carryover actions. They use the same word. I guess my feedback overall is that the issue of carryover not being used for students in the same way that the rest of the S&C funds have been, and instead being put into ending balances of districts or just being absorbed into base funds. This is a real problem that we saw in the state auditor's report, and I see it in my own districts. So this past year, 2021, 15% of our S&C funds, some of it was never budgeted into our budget system, which means it wasn't available for anyone to spend. And then the rest of it just hasn't been spent yet. We haven't completely finished closing the books, but I was under the impression we were almost done. So, to not spend 15% is a significant amount. But if you looked at the parent budget overview that was published with our LCAP that we approved by July 1st, you would see that it said our estimated actual spending was the entire apportioned amount, even though I can tell you that it wasn't there for people to spend, that 15% of it wasn't spent. So part of this problem is basing this entire how much carryover is there on estimated actuals that people are writing into their LCAPs in May or even earlier are not really the actual estimates that get spent when you close the books 3 to 4 months later. So I still think we will certainly be having this problem of funds being carried over that are in no way visible to the public that will not be spent on the students. Again, I really feel like the proposed solution with all these additional columns and trying to put things into percentages is adding components that of the Ed Code but aren't really there, and it's going to make this extremely confusing to take things from dollars into percentages and add other percentages and then get a percentage and then turn that back into a number. It will be difficult for anyone to follow, as I think even people today are finding it very difficult to follow. And trust me, it was only when I saw the PowerPoint yesterday that I realized that I needed to do a lot of research, and which is what I spent yesterday afternoon doing. I just really, really think we need to rethink this idea. Well, I mean, really, I guess what I'm advocating to both the CDE and the State Board of Ed is to go back to the legislature and say that paragraph D makes little to no sense, and it needs to be modified into something that can be actually implemented. It says to add dollars and percentages together and then compare the total of that to the total of another thing that you've added dollars and percentages together and express it as a percent. I mean, it's a little crazy making, and I don't know that that was the intent behind it, was to make it complicated. If we're going to, again, I'm going to point out in the code where it says calculate a percentage improvement, it references that should be using it should be done per the regulation. So I will also encourage that the regulations be updated with instructions on how to calculate a percentage of improvement of an additional action, which is what's unfortunately in the Ed Code. So again, I think just saying that we're going to train people, I don't know how you'll train the public on how to understand what you've trained the different implementers to do, and it will be implemented differently everywhere. And so I guess I would say that, I guess I'm proposing that we actually take the total planned improvements that are a percentage and translate it back to dollars, take the total estimated actual planned improvements that are a percentage, change it back to dollars, and then subtract the two so that we can actually do it that way. That's my feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
I just said thank you.
Oh, all right. Thanks, Kimberly. Thanks, Josh. I'm going to toss it to Linda. Go ahead, Linda.
Linda, I think you're on mute.
Okay, better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make three brief comments. One is Kimberly's point about that number on your chart table being the estimated amount versus the actual amount received, the apportioned allotment, is critical, because I think whether there'll be some years where the estimate is over what districts receive and some years where it's under, but in either case, it makes the calculations, in a sense, untenable, and not fair to the districts. I think we really have to keep in mind that we need to make sure that we're using real dollars and numbers and not an estimate that maybe got changed before, or after we had to deal with something. So that, I think, is critical. The other thing that I think is built in here too is very similar to what we were talking before, and that's the question about the column asking for us to, in a sense, estimated percentage impact of qualitative services. To me, the same kinds of issues that we raised in the first portion of our discussion are also here too. And then finally, the third comment is, and this is something that probably none of us can deal with or impact right now, but the underlying problem is twofold. And one of it is making sure that all of us have the opportunity to think through and allocate funding for the groups of students for whom we are responsible to, who generate these funds, that we are really doing our best to make sure that happens. But it's incredibly difficult in a district, in a state, which so underfunds education. And we are fortunate for this year, perhaps next year, where there are additional dollars coming to us through the federal government and through the state budget process. But if we find ourselves in a place where we are so incredibly challenged financially to support our programs and services in the district, we're going to run into the same kinds of problems that led to this situation. And so those conversations about adequacy of funding, those conversations to say, is California really going to be, as a state, among the lower funded states for education, or does California value education, need to stay front and center? Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Josh, I don't see any other questions. Please continue on with the next two sections.
Okay. So the next section here is the concentration grant add-on. Within the concentration grant add-on, there was an additional 15% added to the concentration grant calculation for LEAs that receive that concentration grant add-on. And the requirement within Education Code Section 52064B11 requires that the template include a demonstration of how the additional funding that's being received as a result of this concentration grant add-on will be used to increase the number of credentialed staff, classified staff, or both that provides direct services to students on school campuses with greater than 55% unduplicated pupil enrollment. And so to address this, we've already put it up on the screen here for a little bit. We're proposing to add an additional prompt to the increased or improved services section, allowing each LEA to provide that, or at least for those LEAs that it's applicable to provide that demonstration of how those increased concentration grant add-on amounts are being used to increase staffing per that requirement. So the proposed prompt for the concentration grant add-on is a description of how the additional concentration grant add-on funding is being used to increase the number of staff providing direct services to students at schools that have a high concentration of foster youth, English learners, and low-income students, as applicable. Within the instructions for that prompt read as follows. Describe how the LEA is utilizing the concentration grant add-on funds received consistent with Education Code Section 42238.02 as amended to increase the number of certificated staff, classified staff, or both, including custodial staff, who provide direct services to pupils on school campuses with greater than 55% unduplicated pupil enrollment. The description must include the number of staff members either hired or transferred and the type of direct services provided to students. So that's the addition. And again, just to go back to it, it would be within the increased or improved services section. It's the description that's down here at the bottom in terms of how is this being utilized to meet that requirement. So questions?
Go ahead, Kimberly.
So is there any idea that there's a requirement that these additional concentration funds need to be tracked in their own account code, the way that some of the other federal or state funds that have very specific purposes, like for certain staffing? I've seen that those had their own separate codes, so that is there an expectation that districts will be audited on this, or that it needs to be tracked in some way?
I'm afraid I can't really speak to that. That would fall within the Department of School Fiscal Services division as to whether or not those sorts of things were going on or were being tracked or were included in the audit guide. Within the statute, there wasn't anything specifically requiring that to be included within the audit guide. Essentially, for purposes of the LCAP, there was this requirement to include the demonstration of how that's being done. Now, because these funds are also part of the requirement to increase or improve services, we would anticipate that these actions utilizing these funds would then be included, well, they have to be included in the LCAP and the contributing tables, et cetera.
And kind of a follow-on is, if these concentration funds that are supposed to be spent this way are part of your carryover, does the limitation on how to spend them follow them then into the following year. I mean, I'm not sure. Again, if no one's tracking it, I don't think there's any way to figure that out, but just wondered if anyone had thought about that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and then I guess I'll say that it sounds like there's going to be actions and services details in the LCAP in future years, in like 22, 23 forward for these additional funds. And, you know, in my district, it turns out to be close to $2.65 million, so it's pretty significant. It feels like there should also be action and services detail in the supplement for the 21-22. I saw that the supplement talks about having a location in your LCAP where you're calling them out, but since they weren't known about, they wouldn't have been included in people's budgets or LCAPs. So I guess I'm just saying, to be consistent, you know, as we're moving forward, where there will be individual actions and be in the tables, it feels like they should be handled the same way in the supplement. So I just wanted to say it here because we're talking about this additional money. Thanks.
Yep.
Oh, go ahead, Josh.
And before you hand it off, just to speak to Kimberly's last point, within within Assembly Bill 130, Section 124, as part of the requirements related to the supplement, there is this clause in Section 124A to B that requires actions for that requires the actions utilizing that 15% add-on to be added to the annual update summary table for the 2021-22 LCAP. So the kind of the statutory or the requirement related to, you know, in including them within this the annual update table or the supplement table, they're actually supposed to show up in the annual update table for the LCAP.
All right, so I'll throw out though that if they are in the annual updates, but they weren't in the original tables or actions because we didn't have this money when we wrote our LCAPs, is it then going to drive some of these calculations where we're comparing total spent with total budgeted again? So they weren't budgeted. So I just want to caution that when we start throwing things into tables in the annual update that weren't there in the budgeted, and we don't add them as a budget, then we're not really going to be comparing what we want to be comparing.
Okay, Melanie.
Yes. I would also say be prepared to be audited on everything because AB 130 and 104 is going to come at us. So with that, I will pass it over to Tara. Go ahead.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks, Josh, for this explanation. I had a question. So is there anything about the prompt that will enable readers to understand what the additional staffing may look like at other schools that are not 55% or more unduplicated pupils? Because I guess if the intention of the funds is to benefit those schools, how will we know just from a description of what staffing changes are there unless there's a comparison to the other schools as well?
I'm afraid I don't understand.
Let me see if I can rephrase. So when I look at the PowerPoint and the prompt, you're proposing to add a description of how the additional concentration grant add-on funding is being used to increase the number of staff providing services at those schools that have a high concentration of unduplicated pupils. But
correct.
for readers, if it means that there are going to be lower pupil teacher ratios at those schools versus others, I think readers will be able to understand that better with a comparison to what those ratios are, for example, at other schools.
Okay.
We know those patterns are so wide-standing and inequitable in the state, and I think that's part of what this concentration grant here is meant to address. I guess I'm just not sure that the prompt is going to get to that kind of information.
So do you have a suggestion?
I mean, I think the phrase, in comparison to other schools would get you there. To say we're going to have a counselor student ratio of 1 to 200 at our school, serving a higher percentage of unduplicated pupils, and it's 1 to 500 at other schools. I don't know, but that comparison to other schools would, I think, get to the intent of that funding and statute.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, with that, Josh, you can go to the next section.
Okay. So the next section is the supplement to the annual update to the 2021-22 LCAP. This is a requirement, as mentioned earlier, of Section 124 of Assembly Bill 130, and it requires the State Board of Education to adopt a one-time supplement on or before November 30th of 2021. The supplemental template is required to include 5 components. And so the components are: 1, a description of how and when the LEA's community members were engaged in the use of funds provided in the Budget Act 2021 that were not included in LCAP. 2, a description of how the additional concentration grant add-on was used by the LEA to increase the number of certificated staff, classified staff, or both, as we just discussed. 3, a description of how and when the LEA's community members were engaged on the use of one-time federal funds intended to support recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on distant learning on pupils. An update on the implementation of the Federal American Rescue Plan Act and the Federal Elementary and Secondary School Relief, or ESSER, expenditure plan, including successes and challenges, and a description of how the 21-22 school year fiscal resources are being used consistent with the applicable plans and aligned with the LEA's local control and accountability plan. So in light of this requirement, we've put together a draft of a supplemental template and instructions that's included in your item as attachment 4, and was way too big to try to include on any slides. So in terms of the template itself, because it's a supplement to the LCAP, we've formatted it kind of in the same way as the annual update to the LCAP. This, though we haven't noted it within the slides, this is included or intended to be considered as part of the 2022-23 LCAP. And so it's required to be included with the 22-23 LCAP for purposes of review and approval and posting and adoption and everything else. So the draft template, you've got those 5 prompts that are in there, and then instructions that correlate to them, as well as specific a description of the specific requirements for providing the required update to the local governing board on or before February 28th of 2022. So hopefully you've had a chance to look over that and we'll open it up for questions.
And Josh, you said we have to do this, right? It's in the legislation.
Correct.
So it would be snarky if I said, did the legislatures actually read the ESSER plan, which asks you to talk about your stakeholder engagement and align it with your LCAP and talk about your value? That would be snarky, right? That would be mean to the legislature. So I won't do that. Instead, I will pass it to Kimberly. Go ahead.
I would echo Melanie's snark and say there has been an awful lot of plans. And hey, I strongly believe in stakeholder engagement, but at some point, our staff at our districts are running around like crazy people doing reports that it's not clear to me very many people are reading. All right, having said that, I was just wondering, is it possible for the instructions for question number 1 to be very, very clear about which pots of money, which funds have to be included in the stakeholder outreach because they weren't included in the LCAP?
Yes.
I'm assuming it means state funds, but when I go back through the budget and as the budget as adopted, which means we didn't know about it when we wrote our LCAP, there's a lot of little pieces, and I don't understand exactly which pieces we have to get input on and which ones we don't. And maybe it's mainly the additional concentration funds, but I think that might be helpful to districts. And then also in question number 3, I just want to clarify that the one-time funds and that we have to talk about how we're doing stakeholder engagement, that is just ESSER 3, or is it also including any of ESSER 2 or 1?
So in terms of this particular description, the one-time federal funds, at this point in time, I believe that is specific to those ESSER funds that were provided through the American Rescue Plan Act. So it would be those ESSER 3 funds, not the ESSER 2 funds that were received earlier. But again, that's something that we'll get clarification on and provide more specificity for in the instructions so that it's clear what particular funds are being referred to within those prompts.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I'm not seeing any other questions. Josh, do you have any more pieces, or is it time for us to go to public comment?
There's just one more piece. It's in terms of this, in terms of replacing the word stakeholder. And so over the last year, one of the things that we received some feedback on actually originated with a question from a county office, and then on doing some additional investigation, some discussion with Native American community members. The team here at CDE is recommending that the term stakeholder be replaced throughout the LCAP template and instructions with some other term that's inclusive of the stakeholders that LEAs are required to engage with, such as teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, local bargaining units, parents, students, etc. Because of the connotation that exists with, or the connection that the term stakeholder has among Native American communities relating to staking claims on land. And so for some of our Native American community members, that the use of that terminology within the template has created a barrier for them to engage in the process, because when they're handed the plan to look at, they're like, oh, we don't want to be called stakeholders. And so we're looking to see if we can't replace that terminology with some other like term, so that there aren't those barriers to engagement for our Native American community members. So that's the last piece, and would be happy to receive questions or feedback or suggested terms.
Great, thank you, Josh. I'm going to go to Linda and then Joanne. Go ahead, Linda.
Thank you, Melanie. And Josh, thank you. I'm pleased to see that this is being addressed at the state level, and it shows a greater awareness and sensitivity to folks. I would recommend that we don't look for a collective noun, a noun that describes some group without actually naming who's in that group, because it really is important for all of us to call out who is participating, maybe who's not participating. And I liked your such as, and where it's specified, teachers, parents, administrators, et cetera, et cetera. I would note that can get cumbersome in writing it over and over again, but at least at the beginning of each section or portion of our reporting, we ought to be able to specify who it is, who is providing feedback, giving input, et cetera. So rather than just coming up with a synonym for stakeholder, I think we ought to start off by naming the people who are participating. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Joanne?
I don't have a comment on this particular section. I didn't know if you were going to do general comments and feedbacks before we went to public comment, or if I needed to say that now, but it's not a comment on the specific stakeholder section.
Sarah, should we do public comment and then come back for any other general CPAG discussion?
If there's just a general comment, we can do it now.
Okay, go ahead, Joanne.
Thanks, Melanie. I should start off by saying I have a page full of comments and thoughts as we've gone along, but you've heard so much from the group that they don't need to be repeated. I think the essence of all of this is right about how that I'm so happy to hear that training and support is going to be provided. So to the point several have made is thinking through not just how that training and support will happen, because this is so complex and multidimensional and obviously overwhelming. So how that training and support would be provided, the ongoing support, as people have said, both for the people in districts facilitating this process, as well as those on the contributing side of this process. And I'm wondering if, in terms of rollout pieces of this, if there's been thought to the process of even rolling this out, that pieces could roll out at a time with support rather than all of it. I know there's an urgency to get feedback from us on all of it. But if we could think about what would be the process, both to roll this out to schools and districts, but also for their implementation of all of this work, some thought on assistance that could be provided in that way. I just wanted to comment on the particular sensitivity. I feel as though this is an evolution of this planning process to really get it. Some of the issues that are specific to the true continuous improvement for specific groups of students in the community and tracking the impact of that. And I so appreciate the attention to qualitative and quantitative measures and more creativity and openness to the use of local measures to do that. Just think putting all of this together for the first time and trying to do it perfectly, as school folks always try to do, and to understand it to the detail is going to be difficult, and it's going to need a lot of support. So I guess what I'm saying is just re-emphasizing the need to think about how it rolls out, what is the process for even use in the school communities, and how to continue to provide school support in doing that.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Kimberly?
I guess a general comment, and this harks back to a point that Linda made earlier, is it's really about the entire premise of LCFF, supplemental and concentration funds. And when this legislation was first put in place, it was very much about flexibility for districts, very much about these are not categorical dollars. We don't want to think of them that way. We don't want to add work that is just busy work and compliance work. But I think most of us, would have to acknowledge that saying that taking a dollar figure and then turning it into a percentage of increased or improved services, and then saying that is really the basis of how you're supposed to decide when you've done enough or spent enough. It's just not practical. It's not how people's brains work. It's, so I think at some point we have to bow to the inevitable, is that we base this on money. We can't spend time that we should be spending on educating kids figuring out a made up percentage number to show how much we increased or improved services. We just need to really be thinking about, what do the kids need? What can we do for them? And what funding is available to do those things for the kids? So, part of the issues with today's work is that it's built on a foundation of something that's a little untenable. And so I would urge anyone at the State Board of Ed or the California Department of Education to help our legislators see that, and to not keep building more things on top of it.
Thank you, Kimberly. Joanne?
That was actually my last question too, Kimberly. And obviously I didn't go back and study the LCAP template, but I know all of these things are add-ons. I'm just wondering if there's any way to go back and see if there's anything we can take out or synthesize or combine or replace instead of just adding another volume.
Thank you, Joanne. Any other questions or comments before we go to public comment?
So if there aren't, I'd just like to say, if you do come up with or have some thoughts related to replacing the term stakeholder that come to mind, please feel free to email those to lcff@cde.ca.gov because we're interested in hearing the feedback related to that particular component as well. Thank you. And then just really quickly, at this point, we're trying to bring this we're bringing this to the board in September. We'd like to bring it back to the board in November in order to have it adopted, all of the changes. We have to have the supplemental template adopted so that it can be used then by LEAs in February. We'd like to bring the LCAP as well, in part, Joanne, kind of to your point, so that there can be that additional time for training, for implementation, for understanding, and to allow that communication to take place. And then we've got 2 additional opportunities for input related to this. Following the state board meeting and the input that we received from them, we'll be making some revisions, bringing the template and instructions and supplemental template back to our LCAP advisory group, getting their feedback, and then we'll be doing a statewide webinar on October 5th to receive statewide feedback related to version 2 prior to bringing that to the board. So if you have additional thoughts and you'd like to have opportunity for input, you could participate in the Tuesday at 2 webinar. You can also feel free to email us any input additional input you might have at lcff@cde.ca.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. We appreciate all the time you put into translating all the new requirements into what the template will look like. Also, my one piece on stakeholder, the change in the name is I would be curious to see what the group suggests as the more inclusive word, and I would lean towards kind of maybe go on with their recommendation. So I would be interested to hear what they say. But with that, I would like to open it up for public comment. So we will now open the phone line for the public comment queue. Members of the public wishing to provide comment on this item may do so by calling the number on the slide. You will be notified when it's your time to speak. We encourage you to state your name and affiliation for the record. Make sure to turn down your speaker volume of your computers if you're following the live feed. Speakers will be limited to 1 minute. So with that, we'll give it a second for folks to get on and dial that number.
Caller with phone number ending in 9563. You can unmute yourself and begin your 1 minute. Caller with phone number ending in 9563. You can unmute yourself. All right. Caller with phone number ending in 1047. You can unmute yourself and begin your 1 minute. Caller with phone number ending in 1047. Would you like to make a comment? All right. Caller with phone number ending in 5116. You are now able to unmute yourself.
Hi, Jessica Sacco calling on behalf of Children Now. First, I would like to refer you to the letter sent on behalf of the LCFF Equity Coalition, which includes comprehensive feedback on a lot of the issues that you all have discussed so thoroughly today. And I want to thank the members of the CPAG for their efforts to seek clarification. Specifically, I will turn my comments to the $1.1 billion that LEAs are going to receive this year to provide additional staff at schools with 55% or more low-income English learner and foster youth. The staffing increase needs to be relative to the staffing at other schools in the LEA, which have less than a 55% concentration. The current text box is insufficient, even with the instructions that call out the need for articulating a number of staff. There should be a table of the number of additional staff at each concentration school and a summary table of the change in staffing at concentration schools compared to non-concentration schools. Without a comparative table or district-wide data for comparison, neither local community members nor the County Office of Education will be able to determine whether the statutory requirements of AB 130 are being met. Thank you.
Thank you, caller. Caller.
This is Tara. I just wanted to flag that I got a text from someone who was called off mute, but we couldn't hear her. So,
okay, we'll try again. Caller with phone number ending in 9487. You can unmute yourself and begin your comments.
My name is Lexi Lopez, speaking on behalf of EdVoice. We support all the recommendations in the Equity Coalition letter. AB 130 requires LEAs to indicate quantitative actions or qualitative improvements they made using SNC funds. However, the proposed table combines reporting into one description. We strongly recommend separating the descriptions into two columns, quantitative or qualitative, to be consistent with the legislative intent and clear language of AB 130. Additionally, the current draft does not support LEAs in guiding them to describe every action and expenditure in using carryover funds and identifying which unduplicated student groups experience increased or improved services accordingly. We urge CPAG to recommend that CDE staff amend the draft LCAP actions table to include a separate section that directs LEAs to describe all expenditures and actions they have employed using SNC carryover funds. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, caller with phone number ending in 9563. I'm going to unmute you.
Quantitative or qualitative?
Hello, John Affelt from Public Advocates and the Equity Coalition. I appreciate all the thoughtful comments from the committee. The qualitative percentage that an LEA would come up with, if it's going to try that route, has to be tied to a single standard method It's not up to the LEA. The original LCF statute tells us what that standard is. Any required increase or improvement must be in proportion to the S&C dollars received. What that means is LEAs must be required to demonstrate that their claimed quality percentage is in proportion to and commensurate with the amount of S&C funds represented by the percent they're claiming. So if you're claiming that 10% of your $50 million MPP is a quality improvement, you got to show us $5 million worth of quality. Not going to be easy, but at least we're in the same ballpark of knowing what we're trying to figure out. And 52070D1E requires county offices to make sure those quality improvements are demonstrated in proportion to the S&C funds received. So the template, not just training, the template in the instructions need to have prompts and instructions to explain how to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, caller. Caller with phone number ending in 0394. You can unmute yourself and begin your comments. Caller with phone number ending in 0394. Would you like to make a comment? All right, moving on.
Hi.
Go
Hi.
ahead.
Am I on?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Sorry, I forgot to press *6. But good afternoon. This is Manuel Buenrostro with Californians Together. And first of all, I just want to express my support for all of the recommendations provided in the LCFF Equity Coalition letter. And I just want to take a step back and focus my comments on the carryover funding. For many years, this has been a significant issue as a lot of funding that was intended for unduplicated students has not been provided due to the carryover issue. Now that we have legislative language, it is important that we get this right and that we make some of the slight improvements that are in the letter to strengthen that language. For example, we recommend that the template makes it clear what are quantitative and qualitative improvements. We fully support separating that so that county offices of education and their evaluation can better understand what they're evaluating. We also recommend stronger guidance, descriptions, and support for LEAs on what constitutes adequate qualitative descriptions, including on how to assign these. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you, caller. Caller with phone number ending in 1047. You can unmute yourself if you would like to make a comment.
Good afternoon, Chair Green and members. This is Saret Kaminsky with the Association of California School Administrators. ACSA firmly believes that the LCAP must remain an effective community engagement tool that is accessible to all local community partners. Effective community engagement about LEA needs and resources to address those needs yields mutual benefit to LEAs and the communities and students they serve. For these reasons, ACSA is currently working with its members to determine the most effective approach to achieve the objectives of enhanced transparency around the use of LCFF resources to improve student outcomes across the array of state and local metrics. ACSA appreciates the opportunity to be involved in this process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, caller. All right, one more public comment. Caller with phone number ending in 5596. You can unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Good afternoon. This is Liz Guillen with Public Advocates, highlighting 2 points from the Equity Coalition's comments. 42238.07 is clear that LEAs don't have to do qualitative at all. If you can show first that you've met your MPP percentage through expenditures, you're done. We shouldn't be stressing and confusing LEAs with an additional burden of figuring out a qualitative percentage for all actions too, even if that were legal. CPAG members, your comments are correct. It is not legal to double count an action as both increasing and improving. The statute requires a showing as to how the LEA is increasing or improving proportionally. It does not permit an LEA to count a single action as both increasing and improving. That is an illegal double counting, and that would allow LEAs to falsely claim they met their full MPP percentage when they are actually well short. Thank you so much for pointing that out. We really appreciate your diligence in reviewing these. Thank you.
Was that all for public comment, Sarah?
Yes.
Okay, Kimberly, I saw you raise your hand. Go ahead.
A quick comment, and I don't know if it's always been that our public comment is only 1 minute. You know, I know that in our board meetings we give 3, or if there's a lot of public speakers, we give 2. I guess my reflection is just this was an enormous amount of material, and to give people 1 minute seems like we might be missing some good feedback. Thanks.
Thank you, Kimberly. So with that, if there are no other CPAG comments, let me make sure I have all my right windows open. Okay, there we go. With that, I want to thank all of the public comment that was shared today. Thank you for the CPAG discussion. This now concludes item 1. I want to reiterate what Josh Strong said, where if you have more feedback that comes to you as you process any of the items today, feel free to email it. So just appreciate all the time that you all did today. We'll now take up agenda item 3, which is the general public comment. Public comment is invited on any matter that is not on the printed agenda. We'll now open the phone line for the public comment queue. Again, members of the public wishing to provide comment on this item may do so by calling the number on the slide, and you'll be notified when it is your time to speak. We'll give folks a second to dial in if they need to.
We're going to wait a minute to account for the delay between the Zoom and the live feed.
Then I will add that we encourage you to state your name and your affiliation for the record. Please remember to turn down your volume on your computers if you're following the live feed.
Caller with phone number ending in 1047. Would you like to make a comment for general public? Oh, nope, they left. All right, there's no one in the queue for general public comment, Melanie.
Thank you, Sarah. This concludes the August 20th, 2021 meeting of the California Practitioners Advisory Group. I want to thank all of you for a great meeting today. Thank you, Josh, for hours of helping us understand all the different pieces. So thank you, CDE and Josh. Thank you, State Board. Thank you, Board Member Eileen Strauss. I will adjourn today's meeting at 12:49. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.